Your host for today is Simon Fell. Since February 2019, Simon's been the independent chair of Digital Television Group. His career spans 5 decades across IT, online and broadcast media, telecoms, and airport technology. Remember airports? Simon is a fellow of the RTS, the SMPTE, and the RSA, something of a triple threat. So here to lead you through your lockdown TV tech, please welcome Simon Fell.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming today. We've got a great panel for you today. Thanks, Phil, for the introduction, and thanks to the RTS for hosting us. I'm chairman of the Digital Television Group, as Phil said, and we work with industry to bring about interoperability between all the many different standards of today's digital world. We were formulated originally around the premise of launching digital terrestrial television. And over the years, we've developed, and we've gone from doing widescreen television to ultra-high definition television, high definition television, etc. And so we are where we are today in this complex world of mega technology that we're all surrounded with, and we've all become great experts at in recent weeks. So I've got a great panel today. I'm joined by Chris Johns, who's Chief Engineer of Sky Broadcast Technology and Strategy. I've also got Simon Gauntlett, who's the Director of Imaging Technology and Standards at Dolby. And I have Yvonne Thomas, an ex-colleague of mine from the EBU, who is now the DTG's strategic technologist. And so Yvonne's going to join us. She's coming in from Germany today. So thanks to Yvonne, too, for joining us. So without further ado, let's get into a short introduction from each of the speakers. I'll then open the floor to questions and answers, and let's move on to Simon Gauntlett to start things off then, if you're ready, Simon.
Good afternoon, everyone. So yes, as we say, my name's Simon Gauntlett, and I work for Dolby as the Director of Imaging Technology. And I'm sure, like me, you've all been sat in your living rooms watching the events happen over the last few weeks during lockdown. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about what's been going on and the technology trends that we've been seeing. So even before lockdown started, these are some BARB figures that are available. You could see that subscription VOD households were increasing at quite a rate. So more and more people were signing up to subscription VOD services anyway before lockdown. But what happened at lockdown was that a fifth of UK households signed up for streaming services. So all of a sudden, a massive leap forward in terms of the reach of streaming services. And the one that benefited particularly from this was Disney Plus, which happened to launch in the UK just as lockdown started. And it's emerged as one of the biggest names in streaming now. Now, we're in an age where we've been, over the last 5 to 10 years, we've been dramatically improving the quality of audio and video content for television and for streaming. And I'm sure most of you know this, but just to go over it very quickly, as we move to Ultra HD, there are lots of components. There is adding higher resolution, what we say more pixels, so going from SD to HD to UHD, 4K to 8K. There's adding a wider color palette and high dynamic range, which I think are terms that more people are now aware of, which give us a much richer palette to be able to, for the creatives to be able to create content. And we colloquially call that better pixels. There's also high frame rate, so showing more pictures per second, and that we call faster pixels. And not to forget about the audio aspects as well. So next generation audio, NGA, starts to deliver us immersive audio and interactive audio. So that all sounds really good. And from a production and delivery point of view, these are the things that we are now creating content using these new technologies. Unfortunately, what the consumer is seeing is a lot of marketing terms and a lot of technology terms, which frankly most consumers haven't got a clue what they mean. I mean, the average person on the street wouldn't have a clue what eARC is, or HLG, or a number of the other these terms. So there is a lot of confusion out there, which presents us with a challenge. It also presents the producers of content a challenge, because they need to know what content's producing and how they are then delivering to the devices. So what we at Dolby, recommend as the best practice is to produce the content in the highest possible quality, and then convert to these other versions of content needed to support other devices by using things like metadata or information to say how you want those other versions to look. So in the video world, we have what's called Dolby Vision, and you can create, producers can create a single IMF production deliverable, which can then be converted to be shown on an HDR device or an SDR device, or converted down to a number of different similar devices. The same with audio. Again, we have a technology called Dolby Atmos, which allows you to create a much more immersive and flexible audio representation using objects and more channels. But that single deliverable can then be used to recreate in a home cinema environment, in a more typical home environment, or even down to headphones. And in the ideal world, the streaming service presents to you the best version of that content for the capabilities of the device. So when it works, and here we see one particular episode of The Mandalorian on the Disney Plus platform, but on different devices. And I don't know how well you can see this but on the screens, but it will present it and tell you, you can get this in 4K and Dolby Atmos or HD and 5.1, or on all the different devices. It will just present you with the best version. So that's what happens when it works well. Now, as we all know, everybody has a typical viewing environment in their household. This is obviously my house, not. So no, we don't expect everybody to have these sorts of home cinema environments. Most people's houses look much more cluttered and much more like this, which is why it's really important for us to be able to deliver content to everybody, and then allow them to use whatever equipment they have in their house to be able to get the best possible quality experience. And the biggest challenge here is related to a term that we use quite a lot in the industry around interoperability. So making it work. We know it's complicated. We know, plugging in all these different devices is complicated. But what makes that possible, and what makes the best experience for the user, is if it's simple to plug that in and it just works. And so we spend a lot of time, particularly with the DTG and other groups in plug fests, trying these things out, understanding what works and what doesn't work, to try and deliver a better experience to the consumer. So that's all I was going to say in the introduction, Simon. So back to you.
Thank you, Simon. It's much easier when we're all called Simon, but anyway, we're going to try Chris out again in a second, and he might sort of interrupt in the background and cough or something. We don't know, just to make sure his sound's all right. But he seems to be back with us. We'll see. In the meantime, Simon Gauntlett, just referring to your discussion then, how well understood is the process of using, say, high dynamic range today in production? Is that something that's becoming standard, or are still people still working their way through the intricacies of how to get the best out of it?
Yeah, I think there's still a learning curve going on. It's being used in a lot of different genres. So certainly it's being used a lot with the high-end productions, with the dramas, natural histories, and that kind of stuff. They are all already, and have been for some time, creating content in high dynamic range. They've just not been able to necessarily deliver it to the consumer. But we're now starting to see work go on to deliver high dynamic range in live events, in sport and entertainment and other genres as well. So there's a lot of learning going on, and it really does make a massive difference to the quality of image that you can deliver to the home, and the consistency of that image, which ultimately is what the creatives really want. they spend a lot of time creating a lot of lovely content. So they want to ensure that that content is delivered in that way, back all the way down to the consumer.
Yeah, good, thank you. Okay, so Chris, can we hear you? Are you there? Do you want to speak?
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, so away you go. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks very much indeed. So, yeah, apologies earlier on. Technology, as always, catches you at the last moment. So, Chris Johns, I'm part of the Broadcast Strategy Group at Sky, but I also have the pleasure of being part of the DTG's Ultra High Definition Forum group. So, kind of a lot of work has been going on in this area. But what I thought I'd just briefly do is take you through where we are now. This is effectively the here and now in 2020. We have 4K, we've got high dynamic range and immersive audio. So as Simon was saying, high dynamic range is not just more pixels, it's better pixels, it's more colors, it's brighter colors, it's 10-bit rather than 8-bit. So we can get an altogether better experience. And from what we've seen, and I've had the pleasure of being able to look at high dynamic range, it actually improves the image quality. The actual resolution is perceivably better with HDR than it is with SDR. I shall skip over the rest of the gratuitous advert, but we launched last week, and at the moment there's just some basic documentaries for those who've got the right set-top box and TV, but there's obviously going to be more to come as we move forward into the year, and it's just a little bit of a pity that the Olympics didn't kick off this year as well. So moving on. Evolution of technology is accelerating at a great rate of knots. Especially now we're into the digital age. And as you can see here, just a very simple diagram compressing the last kind of several centuries. And we can see that as we hit the digital age, everything is accelerating. Analog TV was around for many decades. And then with the advent of digital and in kind of 96, and then we had HD, and then we had 4K, and we'll skip over 3D. But there were lots of innovations in a very, very short space of time, and now we're into IP as well. So what does the future hold for us? I've listed there 4K, 8K, holography, dimensionalized TV, personalized TV, lots of things to look into. But I thought we'd start off with something a little closer to my heart. As Phil said, T. Now, you could say that T is very much like where we are within the TV industry for the consumer as we stand at the moment. I could have put it better with Forrest Gump saying, life is like a cup of tea. It's all in how you make it. But I'm an Assam person, so you can see where I sit in the descriptions I'm going to give you in a moment. So we can start off with the more basic television elements of it, like mono sound, just moving into stereo, analog and standard definition, color, if we're lucky, and coaxial connections with ghosty images, and very few channels, if you remember back to those days. That's what I see as I put a picture of a Lipton's tea bag there. Lipton's is very hard to get in the UK. It's safe to say it's not well received. It's sort of a substandard product. So the old analog television has moved to the background now. It's in the side stalls. We tend not to watch it, and if we can, we want to move on to something more sophisticated. That's when we move into stereo, sound, digital television. Even though it's still standard definition, we've got color, it's reliable. We use SCART or RGB and possibly HDMI. And we now need an EPG because there's so much more channels to actually look at. And this is more the kind of the teas you can get in all your supermarkets. It's the general run-of-the-mill tea. It tastes okay, but could be better. Now let's move on to where we are moving towards. High definition. It's digital. It's got 5.1 sound. It's more of an immersive audio than we had before. And we've got color. We've got HDMI, which is a digital interface. We definitely need an EPG now because there's so many more channels now we're in the digital high definition world. We need an intuitive remote, and we've also got VOD and OTT. This is really the PG tips, the Tetleys or Yorkshires of the world. Everybody's got it. It's a nice cup of tea. You can really enjoy it. Sit down and enjoy your television with a cup of tea. I mentioned I'm more of an Assam person. This is where you get to the real immersive audio that Simon dipped his toe into. This is the Atmos, the up-firing speakers and ceilings. Ultra high definition. it definitely is better. We've got HDR, those deep colors and brighter pictures, HDMI 2.0 and IP deliverables. We've got an EPG now, which has got voice control, so you can actually ask the EPG for recommendations as to what you want to watch. The remote is more complex, but it's also simpler, simply by virtue of the fact you can ask the remote to change channels rather than fiddle around with your fingers. So we've got this added technology, but it's also being made simpler by the technology we're using to implement it. So kind of that's where I'm seeing it. It's more, how would we say, a more refined tea. We're moving through the scales. We're sitting somewhere where we can enjoy something and we can really start to appreciate it. Now, as we move forward a little further, things that everybody's talking about, it's the 8K, the high frame rates, the HDR with deep colors still, but those bigger screens. This is what I see more of as a lapsang souchong tea, if I may put it like that. It's niche. You have to have the right palate to appreciate it. Some households may not be able to appreciate it because of the size of the screen or the distance they sit from it. But at the end of the day, there are going to be some aficionados who really do appreciate kind of the vibrance and the resonance of that 8K can deliver and the size of the screens. And as we saw earlier on, it's Simon's living room that really does benefit from the 8K. So as a sort of summary of where we stand now, if we look at all those different standards, where is the peak? And that's kind of the question that kind of is maybe we answered today. Have we peaked at just HD, or is UHD 4K going to be the peak of resolution, and with immersive audio and HDR, the peak of experience we really start to appreciate? If we move forward from 4K, are we really going to get the benefits of those added pixels in 8K? Where do we stop? Do we keep going? Do we go VR? Do we start to look for holographic television? Or is the majority of the population, the consumers, our customers, are they all going to be happy with 4K or possibly even HD? And the question for everybody here today is where will that peak stand? So something to think about, and possibly when you ask the question is to decide what kind of tea are you? And with that, I'll hand back to Simon.
Thank you very much, Chris. I never saw you as a fortune teller, but I can imagine, with a sort of gypsy scarf on or something like that, maybe you could read the tea leaves for us and tell us that how will the EPG look in the future? You already have voice recognition, and I'm already asking it to turn the subtitles on and off, which makes life easier. How do you see the future EPG being when we try and incorporate all these things like ultra high definition, high dynamic range, next generation audio? Are we going to need more information in the EPG to tell us what's going on, do you think?
Well, ideally, you shouldn't. The set-top box would recognize exactly what kind of screen you have connected to your set-top box or any external device, and be able to adapt to give you the best picture that it possibly can from the content that is available to it. So there is always the conundrum that on any platform you may have different suppliers, and you may find that supplier A may only have the film in HD, while supplier B supplies it in 4K. So there will always be that conundrum. But what we've got to try and do is make sure that the user always has the opportunity to see the content in the best possible way as we move forward. And that, in my view, should be seamless. Viewers shouldn't have to think about which buttons to press and where to go and get that content. It should just appear on their screen in the best possible quality.
I agree. Thanks, Chris. Okay, so Yvonne is our our technology strategist at the DTG, and she's going to tell us a bit about how we work with industry to try and make sense of this very complex world we live in today. So over to you, Yvonne.
Yeah, thank you, Simon, and good afternoon, everyone. As said, my name is Yvonne Thomas. I'm part of the DTG team, taking care of the technologies for the next generation media delivery. And one part of our work is we have a team around testing, centralized testing to ensure the interoperability. So we've heard earlier that it should be easy to plug and play the cables into the devices, and it just simply works. So through the testing, we ensure that there's really the pleasure of just simply plugging in the cables and the devices, and not having to worry about it. So within this, we're also organizing Plugfest, and that means we gather the industry together, whether it's content providers or device manufacturers, so to ensure that they sit together in a room and based on defined scenarios, test any kind of possible combination of format, whether it's HDR, HFR, any kind of resolution, as well as on HBB TV, et cetera, with any kind of device to see how this performs on various screens and set-top boxes. So that's one of the big goals that we have. And while we see that the quality of experience is becoming more and more important, especially while we see the trend moving towards streaming content. And we've heard from Simon earlier that now with coronavirus, obviously, there was a big push to the trend of streaming service, and the consumption of content has increased a lot. We like to better understand what the expectation really is of the consumer. When we look at the chart here, so it's a survey from the Digital TV Europe, we see directly that the consumer has a very high expectation when we move to next generation delivery. So they expect at least an equal, if not better, quality delivered through IP. And that also means that now a content provider has the ability to send the content not only to the TV, but to various kind of devices. So whether it's on an iPad, on a phone, on a laptop, or any other kind of connected devices that have screens, and obviously that's also available for radio. We need to ensure that the consumer has the experience of having always the highest quality, but it also means that we need to ensure what Chris said, that the consumer has a seamless experience. That means always the best quality for the right device. It's likely not useful to have an 8K or 4K image on a small smartphone on a very small screen, because it uses a lot of bandwidth. So that would just lead to consumer frustration at the end. And that's why we have to much better understand also the way they consume on which devices and what they like to consume as well, and what kind of quality. But it also means that personalization and discoverability of the content is becoming more important. So we know that there's a diversity in audience that we might need to address differently, and to find content probably in a different way, or offer content to a different audience as well. So especially discoverability might be challenging depending on various subscriptions that a user might have. And the expectation as a user would always be, whenever I search for something, the system would recommend me the highest possible quality, whether it's a high resolution version or a version with high dynamic range, or if I want something on subtitling or immersive audio, I like to have that transparency and decide by myself what I like to choose, in order to get also the highest quality appropriate for my device. So the personalization, as I said, is a very high aspect, and through metadata, understanding how the consumer behaves and what their expectations are. While we also see the trend that there are more and more connected devices in the home, it's also a challenge to make them secure. And so we're having a guide to as an in-home connectivity guide to lead on a better understanding what needs to be done within the home environment. So the UK government has a goal until 2025 to have a full fibre coverage for the UK. However, the in-home environment is a lot more tricky to have a stable connection and a proper connection as well. So this guide deals with best practices, what types of equipments are available, and also a retrofit. And there also we come back to the cables, to devices, what happens if I have an old device, an old set-top box, but a new TV set, for example? How can I combine and make the highest quality for what I have in my home? Obviously, Wi-Fi optimization is a very big topic in order to ensure that there's always the best and stable connection. And as well as the smart home security is something that's often ignored, unfortunately. So our goal is to really improve the awareness that security is important, but also give some guidance on what needs to be done. So obviously the combination between broadband and broadcast, as well as delivery to mobile devices, is the trend and something that overall we need to develop this strategy for. And by that, Simon, I'll be back to you.
Thank you, Yvonne. Thank you very much. Before I ask Yvonne one of my traditional questions, just a reminder that you can ask us questions on the system here. So feel free. We already have some coming in, which are queued up for the panel after this. So let's move on shortly now to that. But for now, Yvonne, a quick question. You talked about personalization. You talked about security. Are we asking the poor consumer now to be a security expert, a Wi-Fi networking expert, an expert in technologies from different platforms to work out which way to get the best system? Is there a need for a sort of family persona in terms of personalization, as well as an individual one, which kind of goes with you to your tablet or the other room, that sort of thing, when you're watching on your own? Do you think that's necessary, or are we okay as we are today?
Yeah, so the most important is really to protect your own environment. I mean, your family environment, obviously. So, I mean, Netflix and Amazon, they offer to set up this personalized account. Netflix even has a family separated account, so each member of the family could have their own accounts. But in terms of security, people need to understand what they can do in very, very simple ways, whether it's just using an antivirus software, especially protecting the router, because the router, once it's being hacked, is the route into any kind of device that's being connected in that network, whether it's a security camera, whether it's a TV, a phone, any kind of other smart device of Google, Amazon Alexa, or Google Dots or whatever. So obviously everything can be hacked and controlled. So the router is very essential to protect in order to get my environment protected, and that comes through passwords. So choose them carefully, and we also vote for non-default passwords. So that means when you set up your device, there shouldn't be a default password, but you should be able to set up your own one. Secondary, also always keep software up to date, as well as we recommend also manufacturers to have a centralized context for vulnerability issues. So if there's any question and doubt about anything that happened, you could address the manufacturer as well.
Yeah, good. Thank you, Yvonne. So it sounds like we should all change our password from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 then, is that right?
Yeah, please do so.
So, we're going to bring the panel in now. The first question I have is from Adam Watts of Sony. And this is one I'll point at Simon Gauntlett, I think, because it's right in his street, I think. Many devices already support AC4 for next generation audio. Why do you think there is so little content that utilizes this?
So I think it's a good point. So we are seeing a significant number of devices coming into the market supporting AC4 and next generation audio, and that is always the way it kind of has to be. There has to be a deployed base of devices for broadcasters to be able to consider delivering to those devices. But having said that, we have done a number of trials, so we've proved that it works technology-wise. In the UK, we're pretty lucky. We've got some very good operators and broadcasters within Sky and BT that are already using immersion and height to enhance their audio offerings. And then the thing that everybody's now talking about is about personalization, and is about how you can tailor that audio experience. And it's when you start to do those sorts of things, that's when you need these next generation audio codecs. So I think we're certainly going to see a lot more services using next generation audio over the next few years to deliver a much more personalized service. So I think it's coming, but it's one of those slightly chicken and egg things. We need the receivers in the market before services can launch.
Yeah, I have seen in demonstrations of AC4 the experience of sort of mixing your own sound and moving the audience sound up in an auditorium, for example, which might be necessary with virtual sports we're about to see this summer. But I wonder if you or any other panel members feel that that is something that we're going to see more of, the ability to remix the audio in the home. Do you think that's something the public will take to?
Well, I think if I can come in first, and I'm sure CJ and others will have a comment, but I think, yes, you can do all those things. Would we want everybody to create their own audio mix in their homes? Probably not. But there are some things. So dialogue enhancement is the one that people always talk about, where quite often in people's homes, you can't quite make out dialogue. You'd rather the dialogue was boosted for your particular family environment or whatever. And you having the ability to set some of those things is really beneficial. So I think, yes, you could sit there and you could be the sound mixer for the next Glastonbury Festival or whatever, but I can't imagine many audience members are going to do that. I think it's more about finding simple ways for consumers to then be able to customize and personalize their experience with the limited tools that we would provide. Back
to what Yvonne was saying earlier. Chris or Yvonne, any further comments?
If I just jump in there, I was just going to say that I kind of agree with Simon that audio is very much a lean forward when you're adjusting it. And people, when they're watching sport and things like that, just want to see or hear the producer's mix. People are trained to give the best mix possible when they're creating the content. And, if you're in with your friends, you just want to sit down on top of on the sofa and just enjoy the content. That's what we as broadcasters aim to do. But personalization, it does have an area of interest, i.e., as Simon noted, accessibility is a good one. Whether that's part of the general EPG or being able to mix on your own, or whether it's an app that sits alongside your main TV experience, so those with accessibility needs can actually get the real benefit of enhanced audio or audio description, whilst those who are sitting alongside do not have to have that same, I wouldn't use the word intrusion, but something that they don't need or appreciate in the audio mix. So you're tailoring your content for everybody, but making sure everybody can get the best at the end of the day. And I think that's what we should be aiming for, rather than being too niche. So yes, it does have a position, but there are lots of things to look at in relation to next generation audio. A simple one is, where does the mix happen? Is it within the set-top box? Is it within the television? Is it within the audio device? Each one of those has a different user interface, and it requires different sets of tools to make each one work. So there needs to be harmonization as well.
Yeah, I would agree to Chris and Simon's statements, definitely. So it's not about just the actual audio mix as such, which might also require even some education. So we cannot just throw it at the consumer, because they might need to understand how they can do it. But the personalization aspect is really important. And at the moment, the challenge might be how we present this in a very intelligent and easy to use UI to the consumer. So make it as easy as possible to have the most, the best and most personalized experience for themselves.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. So we've got a question from Tim Marshall, Royal Television Society Thames Valley section. How long is it before we dispense with the flat screen for events and sports and turn that to immersive virtual reality to sit in the best seat in the theatre or stadium? Indeed, if Professor Kevin Warwick, who's at Reading University, has his way, we'll just have Wi-Fi straight into the central nervous system. Anyone want to take that? I don't know, VR maybe. Simon, he's done a bit of work on that. Sky has as well. Go on, who wants to take that? Let's go with.
So I think VR.
Go on, Yvonne. You're in. Go on.
Yeah, maybe just a quick comment. I think VR is at least at the moment a very niche product, similar as it was with 3D. Obviously, 3D still exists, but kind of has found their fan base, which is not definitely extremely wide, but some people enjoy it. It's probably more about augmented reality. Giving more information to what I see, and not just virtual reality in terms of get me into another world. So virtual reality is very, very likely something also for gaming, for the gaming industry. I think that would be my take on that.
Okay. Anyone else? Skype done a bit on video.
Go on, CJ. Yeah.
I was going to say yes. If anybody wants to see some sport in VR, then jump into the VR app that Sky does have, and if sport does start again, hopefully you'll have the opportunity to see some VR within the Premier League as we move forward. It hasn't disappeared, and as Yvonne noted, 3D hasn't totally disappeared either. There are still people who have 3D televisions and want to watch 3D content. And it's available as a VOD offering on at least the Sky platform, so it hasn't completely disappeared. You have to address everybody's needs. So VR, 3D, yes, VR will be moving forward. It's got a place in the marketplace as well. So I think it will get bigger, especially when 5G moves forward.
Okay, good. Thank you.
For me, I mean, I think, if you think about, actually over the next few weeks, we're going to be experiencing sports with no audiences. And it's going to be interesting to see what that's like and how people really, appreciate it. So I think there is a desire to get more involved, to be more immersed in a lot of these things. And as has been said, having 360 video and then VR and then AR and all these other spatial computing technologies allow us to deliver a more immersive experience. So I'm a big believer of that, and I think it will come, but it's still a way.
Okay, Simon, thank you. I did hear that the balmy army sound of the cricket fans, that the England cricketers would like that piped through the speakers of the stadium so that they can feel at home when they're playing abroad, but I don't know whether that will come off. We have a question from Sam Downey of ITV, which is this. When submitting content to a broadcaster, what format should I send them in? I saw ProRes 4444 used as the codec by Dolby. Is there anything else? So I think, Chris, we'll start with you on that one.
Well, the first thing I'd say is go and have a look at the DPP website here in the UK, Digital Production Partnership websites, where all the delivery formats are laid down. And one of the things we're very good at here in the UK is making sure we come together and harmonise our delivery requirements. So everybody from Channel 4, BBC ITV, BT, 5, we all have a common set of delivery requirements, and that's actually detailed there from SD deliveries through to UHD deliveries and the audio associated with it as well. So rather than go into the detail here, go and check the DPP website out or the Sky website for delivering of content, and it should all be there for you.
Okay, well, we'll see if Sam has any further comments on that. Simon Gauntlett, yeah, go on.
Well, just to clarify, so that slide was taken from a deck that we do about delivery of content to Netflix. So that was a specific example that is used. If you're delivering content into Netflix, they ask for an IMF deliverable. So that's where that came from. But absolutely, I think the DPP delivery specifications are the right place to look for delivering to UK broadcasters.
Yeah, I think it's a bit early for IMF. Mainly big content owners are thinking about utilising it because you can embed different soundtracks and different subtitle tracks and versions of the same in a big master format, and then basically cut any version when you play that out effectively. It's a great concept, and it's something that the industry is working towards, but we're not quite there yet. I think people are still locked into fairly traditional methods still. So a question from Nick
it is being used regularly by Netflix, so it is being used.
Yes, they are. That's true. Yeah, but I think a lot of others are not quite there yet, are they?
Yeah, I mean the broadcasters
right down to SIMTI and the working groups there.
Yes, indeed.
They're actually defining the OPL element of it, which allows you to do the multiple audio streams and the various different downstream elements. At the moment,
we're also quite well
IMEC is
represented on
with a
SMPTE.
simple CPL, so it's very simple.
And Simon is, in fact, the UK head of the UK section for SMPTE. And Yvonne, what's your title now at SMPTE?
It's the EMEA governor.
There you are then. So if you have any questions on SMPTE, they can handle that too. So we have a question from Nick Wright, a freelancer. Given the technological gap between video from smartphones and sound recorded on cheaper devices like the Zoom H1N, can recorded footage and sound be decompressed to look and sound acceptable on a 4K TV system? Sound, I think we'll start with you, Simon, I'm afraid.
Sure. So, I mean, user-generated content has come a long way in the past few years. And if you look at any of the stuff that a lot of the YouTubers are putting together, the quality threshold to be successful, even on a channel like YouTube, is really high now. And they do that by using SLR cameras to capture it, so they have high-quality image capture, and they use external microphones, and they're upping their game. So yes, you can record content on a phone, and if you go to the latest telephones, the latest mobile phones, they have very high quality specs, but ultimately they're packing everything into a very small package. So once you reach a certain threshold, you need to start adding microphones and adding other things onto those devices to be able to capture things. So yes, it can be done, and even the BBC have created programs like BBC Click entirely on mobile devices, and it looks and sounds pretty good. But as you get more and more higher and higher quality requirements, you tend to need those peripherals to be able to augment the smaller devices. Yeah.
In fact, I noticed Dolby did an app recently for mobile phones to allow you to improve the audio you can record on them, didn't they?
Yeah, so what Dolby's done recently, we've opened up a lot of our technologies as APIs, so that we've opened those up to developers using what's called Dolby I/O, and there's an app on the iPhone called Dolby On. And these tools are to try and help with things like noise suppression and all the other things that Dolby's traditionally done in a professional environment, but give those tools to some of those independent creators and YouTubers and other people and other developers to be able to integrate those tools into their devices. So you'll certainly see an increase in quality coming from using those tools as well.
Okay, thank you. Right, we have another question now from, this is on the HDR matter. It's John O'Brien from STLD. Which high dynamic range standard do you think will prevail? Oh, there's a tough question. I think we better not ask Simon Gauntlett that one. Let's see. Just give us a general view on high dynamic range standards. Maybe for those that don't know who are on the call, there are a number of different standards around. Maybe Yvonne could start possibly a little intro to that.
So, I mean, from the history, when the ITU started their standardization conversations, there were just two standards under discussion, which was the hybrid log gamma and the PQ. And then there were even more options added. So we've ended up with a single standard with several options. And I think that's also the tricky part. And all of those options have legitimate use cases, basically. So they're being used for various reasons. I find it, to be honest, very hard to say that one would be better than the other, one would be more in favor than the other. So obviously, PQs being implemented in many of the devices already, the same as hybrid log gamma and HDR10. So I think the tricky part is here is also what the consumer understands what that means at the end. So how can they really receive the content, whatever format that is, and having the metadata that really transfers and delivers the content to the home as well. So cameras are pretty good. So cameras can produce high dynamic range. Obviously, as mentioned earlier from Simon, there's a bit of a learning curve during the production. It's not just easy as go. But yeah, I sorry, I couldn't say that there's one favorite.
Okay, that's fine. Chris, do you have a perspective on this?
Yeah, I'd like to say Simon sent me a large amount of money to say that Dolby is the best format out, but unfortunately it didn't arrive in time. I think that one thing that is interesting is predominantly live content produced in HDR utilizes the HLG format, that's NHK and the BBC's developments, whilst if it's packaged media, movies, kind of commission content, that's usually generated in the PQ format. PQ gives you slightly greater latitude and flexibility, but also is a little bit less flexible when it comes to delivering to kind of the vast amount of destinations in a live environment. If you're switching between formats, and Simon will come in to say there are ways to get around this, HLG does have a certain latitude and leniency that lends itself to high dynamic range. So you'll predominantly find a lot of live content is created in HLG and distributed in HLG, whilst packaged content is predominantly created and delivered in PQ or Dolby Vision. So there are various ways of doing it and variants in doing it, and you can package HLG into PQ for final deliverables. Another part of the equation to that is the decode capabilities within the screens themselves. Now, 2016 doesn't seem very long ago, but it's a tipping point where HLG and PQ started to be prevalent in a lot of the screens, but there are still some screens that don't support all the formats. So we need to be very careful when we start to look into how we deliver HDR content to the screens that we can actually address the majority of our consumers. So in that sense, we're looking continuously to find out where their tipping point is, the balance point for people who have screens, and people who have screens that can actually receive the content. It's no good us delivering in a format that can't really be received by the end user. So it is a balancing act, and as Yvonne noted, there are two prevalent formats in the marketplace which are well defined by the ITU and various other standards bodies, and others which are add-ons to that to actually, in some ways, potentially enhance the viewer experience again.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Go on, Simon, you can chip in with your comment.
I'm happy to take my corporate hat off and be completely honest. So the way I describe this is very similar to CJ's last points. There are two fundamental HDR formats. There's HLG and PQ, and the good news is they're supported in pretty much every single television out there. So consumers don't need to worry. So the last thing we want is to start worrying consumers that have I got the right version of HDR in my device and all this sort of stuff. So don't worry about that. There are two base layer HDR formats, and most devices support both of those formats. There are additional enhancement layers. So we offer one with Dolby Vision, but there are others. Technicolor do a solution, Samsung do a solution with HDR10 Plus, which add on to those base layers. And if your device doesn't support those base layers, it doesn't matter. It still plays the base layer. You still get an HDR experience. It just might not be as superior as the enhanced version. So basically what I want to try and get across is that we shouldn't hold off from doing HDR because we're worried that there are too many versions out there. It's not that bad. Everybody can deliver HDR, and people will get an HDR experience because the devices support those, or the new devices support those. Yes, there's a lot of legacy, and you have to manage legacy and that kind of stuff. But fundamentally, in terms of HDR devices and HDR content, pretty much everything will work with everything. It's just that there are some enhancement flavors which exist.
Thank you. Very good answers, all of you. It's an interesting thing. In my career, I've gone from, I suppose, back in the 90s in post-production, we used to be looking at setting up a monitor for what they used to call 26-foot Lamberts, and nowadays known as nits, I think. But in those days, producers would come into a post-production suite in a darkened room and do the grade for their film, their drama. And then it would be transmitted. And when people started to get flat screens and turn the brightness up and get much more dynamic range out of their TVs, before high dynamic range was invented, producers would blow a fuse when they saw it in a friend's house because it never matched. With all the technologies we have at our disposal today, do you think that producer working today would see a better rendition in the home compared to what he sees in the post-production environment? Is that now closer than it was?
Undoubtedly. I mean, the devices going into the televisions, particularly going into the market these days, are incredibly accurate compared to what they were a few years ago. So they are much, much closer to the standards than they ever have been, which is great news. So, but to deliver that consistency of experience, yes, you do need to use some of these things like HDR and some of these other tools to try and get a more consistent experience. And the other thing, which I know others will bring up, the environment that people watch television in isn't necessarily the darkened room that people create content in. And now we're starting to see solutions to that as well. So there's a lot of high-end televisions now coming into the market that have ambient light sensors on the device that can then modify the image to make it appropriate for the environment that you're watching in. So we're starting to see improvements as we learn more about using these tools.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
I would come from a different perspective. Just saying that HDR and all these improvements in image quality, they provide a much higher creativity. So I mean, there's a lot more to play with, and with the original creative intent, definitely. So there's an initiative from the UHD Alliance on the filmmaker mode, and that's exactly, I mean, the question that you had. Actually, the producers want the viewer to see exactly what they had in mind, what they intended to do, and what the grading was. So this filmmaker mode intends to switch off basically any processing in the TV set. So in order through the metadata to deliver exactly the result that was coming out of the editing suite, if you want. So the difficulty, and this is also what they're working towards at the moment, is that the consumer still has the freedom to manipulate the settings, just for the reason, as Simon mentioned, and in the home, you're not in this dark environment as an integrating suite, so it might be a lot more brighter, and therefore the result might not be as equal as in a grading suite. So the consumer might have the freedom, say, I increase the brightness of my screen manually, but actually anything else is with the original intention. So it's definitely a desire to deliver what's being intended in the creative world to the home.
Thanks, Chris. Anything?
Just to finally jump in there, it's quite interesting that the grading environment is still based around 100 nits within the kind of the 5-light backlight, whilst most SDR screens these days have got a kind of around 200 nits plus. So we're still grading traditionally for 100 nits for destinations to 200 nits. So we have to bear this in mind. And I'm hoping that there's work going on within the standards industry to actually investigate this further. And with filmmaker mode, the other thing to remember about that is it is kind of orientated around the lower frame rate and the needs of Hollywood. And I think the one thing we need to address is effectively what the broadcasters need to have with live sport and higher frame rates and slightly crisper, more daylight-orientated pictures, to make sure that the filmmaker mode actually lends itself to what we want with those higher frame rates, because turning every setting off within a TV doesn't necessarily make the picture look better for faster frame rates. It can make it look worse. So I think one thing we do need to do is kind of make sure we don't just think about all television as being filmmaker mode, but we need to optimize it for sport, general entertainment. Televisions have got these days a gaming mode, a sports mode, a cinema mode, a standard mode, and an expert mode. And most of the experts turn all the settings off in that mode. It's worth remembering that TVs do perform differently with different genres of content. And I think what we've got to do as we move forward is appreciate that and make sure the televisions do go into the right modes for the content that's being viewed.
Yeah, there's a good point there. I mean, Yvonne, when you were at the EBU, we were involved in some work to do with high frame rate at the Zurich Athletics. Could you tell us a little bit about what that work showed us and what that might mean for the future of high frame rates in television?
Yeah, that was obviously a very early experiment and a test shooting that we've initiated at the time to better understand what it means to shoot in high frame rate, how cameras operate. So we've partnered with camera manufacturers and as well as TV manufacturers to see the results. So we've chosen sports as what we believe the most appropriate genre really for HFR, which is still the case because there are a lot of movements. What often what we've also realized over time, that especially when we increase the resolution, looking towards 8K, that high frame rate goes very, very well together with a high resolution, or basically high resolution often requires a high frame rate as well. So especially when we do a panning through the stadium or anything, so the camera movement itself, that's also the tricky part. But it definitely works well for sports movement on the field as well. So the camera operator also has to keep that in mind as well.
Yeah, indeed. Simon, anything from you on high frame rate?
The findings that people have had so far has been that, there's only certain types of content where you really see a benefit. So there is a benefit for doing it, but it's on a lot of content you can't see that benefit. Personally, I think it would be great if we could move to some variable frame rate system where you just use more frames when you needed to. The counter argument to that is, well, isn't that compression? That's what compression kind of does. But even the movie industry, they consider 60 frames a second high frame rate because they're traditionally at 24. So it's a difficult area. It changes the look of the content, which is why particularly film people aren't that keen on it. But it can add a level of realism if that's what you're going for. And so, there are some film producers like Ang Lee who are liking it. And there are some sports fanatics who prefer that as the way of seeing sports, because you can see much more about the muscles firing and things. Certainly the stuff that the EBUs did, you could see a lot more in the athletes, which was great. So I'm a fan, but I think it's a marginal benefit for most content.
Okay, thank you. We've covered a lot of ground. There are many more questions that could be asked. We could get into areas like 8K and things of that nature. But before we leave the panel, and I see Phil's just joined us again, he's going to do a quick wrap-up on behalf of the RTS. But before we do that, one question for the panelists. If you were to look towards the future, maybe the next 10 years, is there one thing you can see becoming the defining future prospect for this entertainment world we live in? Because we've all experienced a lot of viewing of screens in the last few months, and even more to come, I'm sure. Is there a way forward, do you think, that's going to give the audience something stunning, let's say in 10 years' time? What would you pick as your favourite? Each one of you, maybe just a couple of sentences each. See stunned silence.
Who wants to go first? Okay, so for me, it is getting mass market adoption of high dynamic range, because I think that gives the biggest benefit for the smallest increase in bit rate. I think resolution's great, but I think it's a significant overhead for all parts of the ecosystem. So for me, getting wider adoption of HDR in more content genres is the thing that people will notice at home.
Yeah, thank you. Chris or Yvonne?
So I would agree to the Sorry,
that, in fact.
Go on, Chris.
I think if you look at what happened with HD, it was very patchy initially, and then it actually burst forth. And now, if you don't watch a channel in HD, it's not really worth watching, in my humble opinion.
Absolutely.
So I think UHD will be very similar. At the moment, it's very, very niche, and there's a very limited amount of content available. But as content ramps up and people start to actually produce this content, especially in a cost-effective way, and incorporate, as Simon said, the HDR element to it, that will become the norm. And I hope that will become the norm within the next 10 years. And as somebody said in one of the questions earlier on, VR is still very, very interesting. And I think that has a place in kind of bringing the consumer in and giving them something to actually experience that is different where necessary. It's not mass market, but something that people can dip their toes into.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Chris. Yvonne, the final word.
I would obviously agree. Also HDR in terms of image quality, simply because it delivers a great image quality at a low bandwidth than would have with a high resolution or high frame rate. So it's just brilliant to see an HDR image. If you haven't, just do it. Take a chance to see an HDR picture. But moving away from image quality, I would think that personalization is really making a big impact to the consumer.
Okay. Thank you very much. So maybe the future holds for us, back to Chris's tea analogy, personalized high dynamic range tea bags that we can all dip into our tea. Anyway, I hope you've all enjoyed the session as much as we have. We've enjoyed putting it together for you. Let's hope that we all come out of this current situation with more production and more work for everybody. And we keep providing the great technology and entertainment that keeps people watching and listening. So in the meantime, thanks from me and the DTG, and it's handing back to Phil Barnes to wrap things up.
I'd like to thank you and Simon, Yvonne and Chris for your insights and expertise today. Don't forget, you can check both the websites of the DTG and the RTS for future events. And thanks for tuning in. Hope to see you all again. But for now, it's goodbye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.